Hello, it's Jason Heath bringing you a special episode today for Contrabass Conversations. If this is your first episode, Contrabass Conversations is a podcast devoted to all things double bass. I call it life on the low end of the spectrum. That was my first tagline way back in 2007, over 10 years ago when we started this podcast. That's still the tagline today. And it is often, probably mostly, almost always actually, an interview show. But I am in recovery mode from the International Society of Bassists Convention, the 2017 50th anniversary convention, and I am bringing you a special kind of episode. And you know what? I'd like to do more episodes like this. And I have some ideas for some other ones. So if you like what we're presenting here, and if you have any other ideas along these lines, let me know. So what are we doing today? We are covering the top 10 gig do's and don'ts as submitted and voted on by you, the listeners. And we did all of this on our Contrabass Conversations community Facebook group. And you can find that by going to contrabassconversations.com/community or just searching for us in Facebook. If you're not a member of the group, join it. I'd love to have you. We're bumping up on 1,000 people, I think, last time I checked. So it's a great conversation there. It's kind of the behind the scenes of the podcast. It's the taking the conversation further. It's the great place to share ideas, submit questions for the podcast, potential guests, questions for upcoming guests, that sort of thing. That's what that group is for. And so this topic I submitted in the group, and it was the idea of Trevor Jones, who is the newest member of the Contrabass Conversations team here. He's the guy behind the new logo, the website redesign, and many other projects we have coming soon. So thank you, Trevor, for this idea. Worked great. I love what we got in store for you on this episode. And before we get rolling here with the main portion of the show, I would like to thank our sponsor, D'Addario Strings, and enter our string giveaway, folks. If you haven't yet, we're giving away 10 sets of Kaplan strings, and time is running out. We're going to be doing this by the end of June. So go to contrabassconversations.com/strings and enter for your chance to win one of these sets. I've been playing Kaplans. I love them. I was playing in the Modesto Symphony a couple weeks ago with them and just love them in the section. They blend so well. They got a great pizzicato ring. They've got great bow response. They're available in light, medium, and heavy tension. C extension strings are available. That's what I'm using. You can also get them in solo tuning, and those are medium tension. And they are, like all D'Addario strings, designed, engineered, and crafted in their New York facilities. I'd also like to thank the Bass Violin Shop. And if you're looking for bass accessories, and who isn't, right? They have all the essential double bass accessories and gadgets. They got pickups, they got strings, they got bow cases, wheels, bass covers, mutes, quivers, rosin, polish, and more. Where do you go? You go to bassviolinshop.com. Okay, here we go with our top 10 list of gig do's and then our top 10 list of gig don'ts. So we're going to go in reverse order, and they are listed as voted on by you. So the one with the most votes, that's number 1, going all the way down through number 10. There were many that did not make the cut, but they are fantastic to read too. And there are tons of responses on these. I've got a link in the show notes to this chain. So you can suggest more, you can comment, you can like. I'd love to know your thoughts, even if you didn't get a chance to participate when we were putting this list together. So number 10 gig do comes from Rob Wasserman, and it is, if you are asked for recommendations, always mention the best you know. Recommending lesser players to make yourself look good will usually backfire for obvious reasons. Oh, and by the way, I could probably go on and on with my own thoughts on all of these and make this a multi-hour episode, and I love to do that, but I'm going to keep it just to your words. So, and again, if you want to continue the discussion, go to that Facebook Contrabass Conversations community chain and throw in your thoughts. So that was number 10 from Ron Wasserman. Number 9 comes from Peter Tambroni. Number 9, gig do. Pete writes, do follow the chain of command. If you're playing with a section and have a question, ask the next bassist or principal bassist. Number 8, gig do, comes from Eugene Ciccone, and I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name right, folks. If I mispronounce, apologies. I am the king of doing that sort of thing. So Eugene's gig do is listen to everyone playing, including yourself. Number 7 comes from Douglas Mapp, who is now the past president of the International Society of Bassists. And by the way, I've interviewed Douglas, I've interviewed Pete Tambroni, and I've interviewed a lot of people on this list for the podcast, and they're all linked up in the show notes. So Douglas has kind of a 3-part one for gig dues, and here they are. Part 1, treat every gig with the same level of respect. Part 2, ask all of your questions before you say yes, relating to whether or not to take the gig, right? And part 3 is have a great time and make sure everyone knows you had a great time. So that's number 7. Number 6 gig do is from, again, Peter Tambroni. And Pete writes, I think a lot of this comes down to the same 3 rules I have for my classroom. Here are the 3 rules. Be prepared, be punctual, be polite. Gig do number 5 on the list comes from Jeremy Bogoyos, who's the past Bass World editor, teaches at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where my dad taught, incidentally. Jeremy writes, nail the part every gig. Nail the part every gig. That's number 5. Number 4 gig do comes from Heather Miller-Lardon, a recent podcast guest. Check out her episode if you haven't. Fantastic. Heather writes, do take a moment to really feel thankful for any gig you've been offered and for the hard work you did that got you to this point. This will put you in a good mindset and help to set you up for success. Beautiful sentiment. Number 3 comes from Mike White, and he writes, be a good communicator. Respond to emails and phone calls in a timely manner. Personnel managers will love you. Number 2 comes from Paul Cannon, again, a recent guest, Ensemble Modern bassist. And Paul writes, bring extra strings. You'll probably never need it, but if you do, there's no other alternative. And I actually have learned that lesson the hard way. You think you're never going to break a bass string, right? I had a defective string issue way back in the day, and I learned that lesson. So thank you, Paul. And we have some kind of follow-up gear-related replies as well. Raymond Irving writes, always have a stand in the car. Peter K. Bowow writes, don't forget a tuner and spare batteries. I use my phone these days, but that's a great idea as well. And Diana Ray writes, stand light, stand, and extension cord. So those all kind of fall under the gear to remember category. That was number 2. Number 1 gig do comes from Brandon Mason. Brandon writes, leave at a time that would make you 45 minutes to an hour early given typical traffic. How many of us have learned that lesson, right? And Philip Cerna piggybacks on that with a nice quip, which is to be early is to be on time is to be late is to be dead. Yikes, but good advice. So again, that top 10 list. Number 10 was if you were asked for recommendations, always mention the best you know. Number 9, do follow the chain of command. Ask the next bassist or the principal bassist any questions. Number 8, listen to everyone playing, including yourself. Number 7 is treat every gig with the same level of respect. Ask all your questions before you say yes to the gig. Have a great time and make sure everyone knows you had a great time. Number 6 is be prepared, punctual, and polite. Number 5, nail the part every gig. Number 4, do take a moment to really feel thankful for any gig you've been offered and for the hard work you did that got you to that point. Number 3, be a good communicator, respond to emails and phone calls in a timely manner. Number 2, bring extra strings, have a stand in the car, remember your tuner, your stand light, and your extension cord. And number 1 is leave at a time that would make you 45 minutes to an hour early given typical traffic. Moving on to the gig don'ts. Number 10 comes from Douglas Mapp, and Douglas writes, do not ask questions that show how smart you are. And he gives some examples like, it sounds like everyone is playing that rhythm wrong. Or, should we make that third a little brighter? Or, are you going to conduct in 4 or 2? So don't ask questions just to show how smart you are. Number 9 gig don't comes from Ron Wasserman. And Ron writes, don't tell the contractor you will get back to them as to whether you can make it, and then realize you can't make it, and then neglect to get back to them. Number 8 gig don't. Chantal Incadella writes, don't take a gig if you don't want it. If you can afford that, of course. Don't take a gig you don't want. Number 7 comes from Peter Tambroni. And he writes, don't just raise your hand and ask the conductor questions. I know this one seems a bit out there, but I've seen it enough times that it's worth mentioning. Always made me cringe. So don't raise your hand and ask the conductor questions from the section. Kind of ties into the follow the chain of command that he had for gig dues. Number 6 comes from Jeremy Bogoyos. Don't ever believe that there are other things that can compensate for not nailing the part. I love that. Moving on to gig don't number 5. Conrad Cornelison writes, don't turn down a gig you already agreed to in order to do a better gig. And that sparked quite a bit of back and forth of conversations with different scenarios and different circumstances. And that could be a fascinating, chunky 3,000 word blog post, I'm sure. So that one, I can see it being contentious. The thing that was brought up is like, what if the New York Philharmonic plays you and you've got a community orchestra gig? There are some people that I know that actually, I said I wouldn't editorialize. Okay, I will stop. Anyway, if you have thoughts on that, go to the thread for this and leave them. So, gig don't number 4, again from Douglas Mapp. And I love this. Don't be a drag. And Douglas then parenthetically writes, I could go on and on about this. If you're not sure about something, don't do it. So, don't be a drag is number 4. Gig don't number 3 comes from Nathan Elmer Ives. And Nathan writes, don't show off. Don't play all your flashiest riffs during setup and between songs to try to impress people. Good advice. Gig don't number 2 comes from Jerry Fuller, a former podcast guest, a longtime friend. Jerry writes, I love this. This one made me laugh when I saw it. It makes me smile every time. Jerry writes, don't show up late to rehearsal with a cup of coffee in your hand. And gig don't number 1 comes from Adam Booker. Don't complain about the gig. You agreed to it. Again, that list of gig don'ts. Gig don't number 10. Do not ask questions that show how smart you are. Gig don't number 9. Don't tell the contractor you'll get back to them, realize you can't do it, and then not get back to them. Gig don't number 8. Don't take a gig you don't want, if you can afford that. Gig don't number 7. Don't just raise your hand and ask the conductor questions. Gig don't number 6. Don't ever believe that there are other things that can compensate for not nailing the part. Gig don't number 5. Don't turn down a gig you already agreed to in order to do a better gig, with some contention on the thread. Gig don't number 4. Don't be a drag. Gig don't number 3. Don't show off. Don't play all your flashiest riffs during setup and between songs to try to impress people. Gig don't number 2. Don't show up late to rehearsal with a cup of coffee in your hand. I love that. And gig don't number 1. Don't complain about the gig. You agreed to it. So this is a short kind of mini-sode about a topic that we threw out there. If you have any other ideas like this, or you like this, or you have some other thoughts in that regard, feedback at contrabassconversations.com will get you in touch with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This show is based on what I hear from you, the listeners, and the direction you want to go with it. So this show has changed course many times over the past decades. I'm always trying new things. That's one of the things I love about podcasting. It's so flexible. It's such a great medium for experimentation. And even though I've put out hundreds of these episodes, I still feel like I've figured out like maybe 5% of this whole podcasting thing. Maybe. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of the potential of this thing and what it can do. So I liked this idea a lot. It got a great response. If you have other thoughts about thematic episodes like this, I would love to hear your thoughts. If this is your first podcast episode, welcome. Great to have you here. There's a lot going on in the double bass world, and we've covered a lot of different things, and contrabassconversations.com is your place to go to dig in. You may want to go to contrabassconversations.com/highlights. That's a way to hear excerpts from all of these hundreds of past episodes and kind of give you a taste of what we do on the podcast. And I'm always proudest of our most recent episodes. I always feel like I'm pretty good with the last 2-3 weeks. And then I feel like I didn't really know what I was doing before that. And then I'm totally horrified at things that are like 5 or more years old. So I'm always working to up my game. I'm always thinking that the latest thing is the best thing that I put out. And I hope that's true. So if you're new, look through our last few episodes. We've covered the International Society of Bassists recently. We've covered theater musicians recently. We've done a whole week on auditioning. We did a whole week on jazz artists and much more. So welcome to the podcast, or if you've been around for a while, welcome to this new kind of episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.